Welcome to Hearthside Histories, a place where architecture breathes in hushed syllables, and the past drifts by like lantern-lit water. Thank you for arriving, no matter the hour or latitude. If you wish, let the gentle glow of the comment lantern tell us from which corner of the map you are listening. Your presence rounds out the skyline of this shared evening. Now, let the lights of the waking city dim in the mind, and drift instead to Paris on a pale spring dawn in the year 1889. Clouds as thin as woven lace trail slowly above the Seine, their bellies tinted with the first flush of apricot. Along the still drowsy quays, the charcoal burners and newspaper boys have not yet appeared, and the river mirrors empty bridges, as though it has forgotten the bustle that daylight will demand of it. Somewhere beyond the left bank, a faint clatter of hooves answers a distant church bell, then recedes like a thought remembered too soon. In this lingering hush, mists coil upward from the water, wrapping stone embankments and sycamore limbs in a soft, unbroken hush, as if Paris itself draws a silken shawl around its shoulders before opening its eyes. Gradually, beyond the rim of the eastern horizon, a new silhouette begins to gather out of the vapor, a framework of iron, unlike any steeple or chimney the capital has known. It does not rise all at once. Rather, it condenses, line upon line, as though some invisible draftsman lifts a graphite point from the hidden blueprint above and traces the air itself. First, the angled legs, brooding and immense, step across the Champ de Mars with the calm certainty of ancient gates. Then the latticed trusses knit themselves upward, a bramble of riveted ribs, until the upper reaches shade into fog like a mountain path, losing itself among clouds. To the curious sparrow circling near, the structure seems less a machine than an awakening skeleton of light. Only 14 months remain before the Universal Exposition is to open its grand gates, promising wonders from every compass point. Yet here, in the cool air of morning, the tower is scarcely two-thirds complete. Its summit absent, its elevators unfinished, its platforms raw as ship decks still under hammer. Beneath the clean song of swallows, one can almost hear the rasp of files and the measured thud of rivets that will soon echo through the day and into the night, for the schedule is tightening like a drumskin. Officials glance anxiously at ledgers. Investors weigh francs against forecasts, and on cafe terraces, talk spreads that the iron colossus may remain a half-grown ruin, embarrassing the Republic before the world's assembled gaze. Beyond deadlines and balance sheets, a subtler storm gathers, one of opinion and pride. Newspapers, proud of their literary heritage, lend column after column to poets and painters who declare the tower a monstrous skeleton, a factory smokestack magnified beyond reasonable scale. They claim it will bruise the horizon, dwarf Notre Dame, cheapen the Louvre, cast shadows over the very notion of elegance that Paris has spent centuries refining. In studios scented with turpentine, in salons where satin gloves hover above porcelain cups, sentences sharpen, an iron nightmare, a barbarous grating, an insult to stone and sky. Yet even as these verdicts float across the city like nettlesome seed, the restless cranes keep turning, untroubled by metaphor. High on the partially finished first platform, ropes still coiled in paint pails waiting for warmer hours, the view already begins to justify the daring. From this trembling floor of metal grating, dawn unfurls the entire arrondissement, as a painter might roll out a newly washed canvas. Domes shimmer with dew, chimney pots seem to exhale silver, and the sinuous river threads the seam together, polished like antique glass. Even the ragged edges of demolition sites, where older pavilions have been cleared for the exposition, soften under the pale glaze of daylight. One is reminded that novelty often appears brash only when seen from ground level. Lifted into broader perspective, it can resemble audacity's quieter cousin possibility. Throughout the night just past, a small cadre of watchmen patrolled the footings, lanterns swaying like muted stars at their hips. In their company traveled the soft ticks of thermometers and the slow creep of tape measures checking for infinitesimal movement within the foundations. For this tower, so effortlessly rising in the public imagination, remains at heart a dialogue between iron and earth, weight and counterweight. Should frost swell the soil even a fraction, calculations must be redrawn before sunrise. And so the watchmen, half engineers, half sentinels, kept vigil beneath tarpaulin awnings, scribbling numbers on damp ledgers while coffee cooled in tin cups. Their unseen diligence is the quiet keel beneath tomorrow's celebrated arches. Far below, a solitary figure pauses near a temporary drafting shed, coat collar turned against the river breeze. Gustav Eiffel, whose name already adorns bridges from Portugal to Vietnam, surveys the skeletal uprights with a gaze both practical and paternal. He carries no illusions of unanimous acclaim. Engineers, he knows, do not trade in applause so much as in endurance. What matters are the load calculations inscribed on vellum, the wind tests conducted on miniature frames, the armies of workers who must ascend slick beams in the cold to drive home each final rivet. Still, a private satisfaction flickers across his face when the sunrise ignites the iron, transforming it from shadow to almost rose gold. Calculation, for an instant, is indistinguishable from grace. Paris itself stands at a threshold no less daring. Republic replaces empire, electricity nibbles at the dominion of gas lamps, and new boulevards spread like pages open toward the 20th century. Some citizens greet these changes with polished optimism. Others cling to stone facades the way ivy clings to garden walls, reluctant to yield their footing. The great iron tower becomes a convenient mirror for worries that have little to do with rivets or wind load. To love it might mean to welcome the future. To reject it might mean to defend a cherished past. And so conversations about the soaring legs become beneath the surface. Conversations about time, identity, and the scarcely articulated fear of becoming strangers in one's own capital. Yet for the men whose boots strike sparks on the steel girders each dawn, debates of aesthetics dissolve into the more immediate cadence of labor. Their names seldom appear beneath newspaper headlines, but their fingerprints stipple every beam. Their lunches of crusty bread and cheese rest on temporary ledges hundreds of feet above the gardens. They fasten harnesses, signal to crane operators with gloved hands, and trade jokes that drift away before reaching the ground. When the sun climbs higher, they will taste rust like salt on their lips, and each evening they will descend, legs trembling not from fear but from the practiced fatigue of a craft pursued at altitude. With them, the tower grows day by deliberate day. Meanwhile, at polished mahogany tables, committees prepare draft regulations proposing height limits for future buildings, fearing that other entrepreneurs will imitate the audacity they can no longer suppress. One ornate petition, already heavy with signatures, pleads for the demolition of the tower the moment the exposition concludes, lest the skyline be forever scarred. Such pages rustle like restless leaves on an unseen tree, portending a wider quarrel between conservation and invention that the new century will inherit. Even letters from foreign dignitaries arrive, some praising defeat, others warning that Europe's cultural crown must not be exchanged for a tiara of iron bolts. Thus the structure collects words as surely as it collects rivets, each threaded line adding tension to what stands unfinished. In the months that follow, storms will lash the scaffolding, painters will dangle like seabirds in gales, and arch lamps will spill new electric halos across the Champ de Mars, confounding owls and delighting insomniacs. We shall watch debates ignite, then cool to embers. We shall follow visitors whose first ascent alters their notion of height forever. We shall trace the tower's shadow into wars, into music, into cinema, and into the quiet rituals of everyday lives lived beneath its beams. But all of that lies in the chapters to come. For the present, the iron limbs stretch patiently skyward, waiting for welders, waiting for spring, waiting for the city to decide whether it will claim or condemn this improbable guest. As the last strands of mist unravel and sunlight settles upon the water like unfolded silk, the bells of St. Sulpice begin their slow rehearsal for the day, and a single gull sketches an arc beside the half-built tower before drifting downstream. Somewhere, a foreman's whistle pierces the lull and is answered by the steady rumble of carts loaded with fresh girders. Soon the clamor will rise, but for now the city lingers in the margin between dream and duty. In our next evening together we shall step nearer to the workshops where molten metal is coaxed into curved plates, and hear how mathematics and craftsmanship entwine like dancers atop invisible music. Until then, let the image of silent iron against soft morning stay gently with you. The hush we left above the broad river remains, like a pale ribbon of mist, drifting between embankments of stone and memory. Dawn has climbed a little higher, painting the slate roofs with subdued silver, yet the echoes of cannon and collapse that once shook the city have at last softened into the background hum of ordinary carts and careful footsteps. Paris, bruised but breathing, greets the new day of her Third Republic with a resolve that feels both fragile and ferrous quiet to the ear, firm to the touch. Only a few seasons have slipped by since the surrender of 1871 scattered its chill across boulevards and barricades alike. Where fires once flashed in municipal halls, slow, patient hammers now ring beneath the same rafters, coaxing charred beams into fresh lintels. The commune's fevered slogans are fading on courtyard walls, replaced by neat notices about sanitation, schooling, and civic repair. Politicians of the newborn republic, cautious yet determined, walk these avenues with portfolios clasped against their coats, intent on turning calamity into composure. They sense that a capital so recently humbled must rise not merely back to comfort but beyond, toward a symbol grand enough to silence doubt and declare continuity. Across Europe, the long breath of the Industrial Revolution has thickened into a brisk, metallic wind. Newcastle stokes its smoky furnaces, Manchester hums with rhythmic looms, Berlin's rail yards whistle through the night. Everywhere, engineers chase altitude as children chase kites. Iron bridges, arc over valleys, stone church towers surrender their primacy to skeletal chimneys, and the telegraph wire twangs with tidings of Torah still to come. In America, newspapers boast of looming skyscrapers. In England, discussions of a mile-high edifice flicker through drawing rooms like mischievous sparks, height calculated in brisk cubits and hushed heartbeats has become the newest measure of modern might. To the stewards of France, no vista is more sobering than the silhouette of the Cologne Cathedral, which still insinuates itself across the Rhine with medieval gravity. Even the languid spire of Rouen, romantic though it is, no longer seems sufficient for the era's relentless arithmetic. The Republic requires an emblem conceived in contemporary materials, conceived for tomorrow, not yesterday. It must speak not only to artists and poets, but to machinists, metallurgists, and bankers whose ledgers, after all, will make the vision tangible. Between the ghosts of Gothic pinnacles and the gossip of New World towers, Paris begins to dream of something unmistakably hers. Thus grows the idea of an exposition universelle, a grand international fair to celebrate industry, science, and the centenary of 1789. The anniversary date itself is a quiet drumbeat beneath parliamentary debates, reminding the deputies that revolution, if recalled with reverence and restraint, can legitimize their still delicate regime. Host the exposition in 1889, they argue, and the Republic reclaims the fervor of liberty while rewriting it in tempered steel rather than tumbling guillotines. The notion spreads through ministries like the scent of fresh bread, comforting and impossible to ignore. By late afternoon meetings inside the Palais de l'Industrie, civil servants shuffle blue-tinted dossiers across walnut tables. They weigh budgets, survey grounds along the Seine, and trace rail connections on crinkled maps to ensure pilgrims can arrive without fatigue. Outside the tall windows, chestnut leaves rustle, gold at the edges, as though applauding each careful calculation. Within these hushed chambers, a second, quieter conversation threads beneath the official one. What single structure, placed at the Fair's heart, could stand like a lighthouse of the modern mind, guiding visitors through corridors of machines and galleries of glass? Suggestions arise as gently as soap bubbles. A monumental fountain, some propose, cascading from tier to tier, each basin symbolizing a decade of progress. Water, after all, is the mother of both life and locomotion, turning turbines and nourishing orchards. Others sketch a tower of masonry, broad at the foot, culminating in a lantern whose glow would rival the evening star. France's formidable ceramics industry offers to cloak the facade in iridescent tiles, catching moonlight with a subtle shimmer. Yet more radical voices, perhaps still echoing the defiance of recent insurrections, float the image of a column styled after the fatal silhouette of the guillotine, sober, severe, a frank reminder of revolution harnessed by reason. While many blanch at the symbolism, none can deny the column's austere magnetism. Reporters in smoky cafes toy with these rumors, tracing rough caricatures on stained napkins, letting ink bleed into circles of spilled absinthe. The public, nursing its wounds, yet eager for wonders, listens with the cautious excitement reserved for circus announcements. Mothers hush children with promises of fireworks over the river. Retired soldiers, medals tucked beneath waistcoats, debate whether English or American engineers might attempt to outshine the French before the fair opens. Through it all glides an undercurrent of national self-examination. What does it mean, after ruin and revolt, to be not only restored but radiant? Parliament eventually drafts a decree, its legal cadence slow and steady, like footsteps on marble. The government, it declares, will invite designs for a centerpiece monument to crown the exposition. The contest shall be open, anonymous, and international, though a provision ensures that at least a portion of the judging panel will understand French ingenuity's subtler shades. A maximum cost is fixed, generous yet finite, so that creativity must consort with economy. The edifice must be constructible within 2 years, adaptable to the fairgrounds, and perhaps most crucially, must demonstrate the predominance of scientific principle over ornamental excess. In other words, let it be beautiful, but let it be beautiful, but let it's beautiful, but let it's beautiful arise from intellect rather than icing. Brochures carrying these regulations drift through post offices, university halls, and engineering firms from Lyon to Lille, from Glasgow to Philadelphia. In Paris, eager apprentices unfold the printed sheets as though unwrapping rare fruit. Red-penciled margins soon sprout beside phrases like minimum elevation, 300 meters, 300 meters. That figure alone, an audacious 1,000 feet, surces the Strasbourg Cathedral by more than half again, and bests the recently completed Washington Monument by an entire ringing bell tower. Over cafe counters and drafting boards, voices drop to a hush of wonder. 300 meters evokes not just height, but horizon, a line where earth yields unobstructed to sky. One brisk October morning, the Ministry of Public Works arranges an exhibition of the earliest submissions. Cardboard models stand in neat rows beneath a glass roof that diffuses autumn sun into a contemplative glow. Visitors shuffle in muffled astonishment, coats whispering against polished floorboards. Some models lean toward classical grace, colonnades encircling a central shaft crowned with allegorical statuary. Others reveal latticeworks of copper and steel, slender yet resilient, as though a bird's bone had been magnified to monumental scale. Nearby, the controversial guillotine-shaped column rises in miniature, its blade replaced by a crystal prism designed to split daylight into roaming rainbows. Serious critics murmur that the prism could symbolize enlightenment. Equally serious citizens fear it might reopen wounds that barely scarred over. Not far away, a fountain proposal gleams under lamplight. Tiered basins spiral upward, each rim perforated so water tumbles in twinkling threads. Concealed turbines promise to power electric lamps, a novel coupling of hydraulics and light. Yet a low murmur acknowledges that even the grandest fountain's apex falls short of the towering thresholds now expected. In these quiet evaluations, Paris confronts a choice: cling to horizontal grace or court vertiginous aspiration. While models occupy the pavilion, correspondents abroad wire stories of still grander fantasies. An American consortium hints at a spiral tower woven from rolled steel, boasting it could host an observatory higher than any alpine pass. A Scottish inventor sketches a floating framework buoyed by pressurized air cells, half tower, half balloon. Ridiculous yet strangely enticing. Each telegram is another pebble tossed into a pond already rippled with resolve. Each renders the eventual French monument not merely desirable but imperative. Beneath the surface of official deliberation drifts a deeper, almost meditative recognition. The desired structure must marry the Republic's political yearning with the era's industrial poetics. It must translate the clang of forges and the calculus of stress diagrams into a form civilians can embrace at dusk, when lamplighters stir and the same reflects the first stars. It should rise in such a way that a seamstress, craning from an attic dormer, feels stitched into the story, that a provincial child arriving by train senses that the nation's ceiling has suddenly lifted. Above all, the monument must offer proof that peace may accomplish feats that war, for all its thunder, never could. As winter clouds gather, the committee postpones final selection, requesting refined estimates and wind-resistant studies. Architects retreat to their studios, tracing more deliberate lines. Engineers retreat to shipyards and ironworks, testing rivets, weighing trusses, listening for the melodic ping that signals structural certainty. The fountain gains additional supporters among those who distrust dizzying heights. The prism-crowned column rallies a cadre of historians who champion candid remembrance. Yet quietly, another design circulates in folded sheets of cream paper, its lattice silhouette so daring it seems almost translucent. For now, it remains a whisper. Evening settles over the city once more, gilding the wounded walls of history with an amber hush. Gas lamps flicker along the boulevards, mirroring constellations that have kept their patient places for millennia, no matter how humans rearrange the crust below. Somewhere beyond the Isle of Swans, a chill breeze threads through poplar branches, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of possibility. Here, in this in-between hour, Paris balances on a threshold 1 foot in the humbled present, one already stepping onto a platform suspended high above common expectation. In the chapters ahead, the lattice whisper will acquire a name, and iron will learn to imitate the effortless sweep of wind. But tonight, the plans rest rolled and ribboned upon mahogany desks, awaiting dawn's pale clarification. The city, lulled by river murmur and the soft tick of drafting pens laid aside, dreams of a shape it has not yet clearly seen, though it already senses the vertigo of its blessing. The ember-red glow that closed the previous chapter still hangs in the twilight, as though the furnaces of memory refuse to cool. In that gentle afterheat, iron seems to breathe, stretching slowly before another night of silent hardening, and the figure of Gustave Eiffel walks once more among the wheeling sparks of his formative years. Much earlier, when the century was young enough to be believed, he had stepped from the colleges of Burgundy with a carefully stitched coat and a pocketful of chemical formulas. Metallurgy, he had decided, was a language sturdier than words, and bridges would be its grammar. Yet ambition did not beat like a drum inside him. It drifted like mist on a river. He was still learning to read. The first crossings he designed were modest arches over rural waterways, slender but resolved, and each one taught a fresh syllable of balance. How wind strokes the flank of a girder, how temperature toys with rivets in the hush before dawn. From these quiet structures, the reluctant visionary began to sense that iron, once persuaded, could imitate the curve of a swallow's wing and the hush of a prayer. Railways soon arrived, clattering toward the Atlantic and the Alps, demanding bolder spans for heavier locomotives. With cautious steps, Gustave entered the wider arena, submitting sketches for viaducts that would stitch together dizzy valleys. His designs were accepted, not because they boasted, but because the lines whispered thrift and reliability to parsimonious investors. At the Garonne River, he raised the graceful arch of the Saint-Jean Bridge, whose soft blue paint mirrored the soft blue mind of its maker. Composed, reflective, unwilling to shout, the press tired quickly of praising him, for he offered few melodramas. Even so, railway managers noted that his calculations rarely erred and his schedules seldom slipped, and in the ledger books of the expanding empire of steel, that was far louder than trumpets. Slowly, what began as contracts became a company. Workshops assembled on the outskirts of Paris, their roofs exhaling feathery plumes of coal smoke that drifted above vegetable gardens and slate roofs alike. Apprentices finding their way by lamplight murmured the name Eiffel, as though it were a verb. To Eiffel a truss was to lighten it without loss. To Eiffel, a schedule was to honor the hourglass. He, however, remained uneasy with reputation. It sat on his shoulders like a cape sewn for another man. Among the young engineers who filtered into the growing offices were two bright spirits. Émile Nouguier, as wiry as the wires he would someday calculate, and Maurice Coquelin, taller, quieter, forever casting mental nets across the unseen forces haunting every beam. Gustave watched them speaking in chalk dust whispers over drafts unfurled like scrolls across tilted tables, and he recognized in their enthusiasm the wind he himself pretended not to feel. Rather than dampen that wind, he offered structure, quite literally frameworks, within which their imaginations could expand without bursting. Meetings were held not in stuffy chambers, but while strolling the yards, feet crunching on iron filings, eyes lifted to cranes that revolved with stately grace against the low Parisian clouds. If a suggestion rang true, it was tested by evening. If it faltered, it was chalked on a slate of lessons, never of blame. Thus trust knitted itself between mentor and protégés, as quietly as ivy binds old stone. Together, they tackled the towering viaduct at Garabit, in the highlands where fog mingles with heather and sheep bells. The valley yawned 122 meters beneath the surveyor's boots, and some said granite cliffs would shake loose if an iron arch were wedged between. Gustave listened, patient, then asked Nouguier and Coquelin for numbers, not opinions. They returned with figures so lean they almost vanished, a geometry of half-hidden strength that curved like a crescent moon. The Garabit construction advanced in pallets of russet, steel rivets ringing soft lullabies across the gorge, and when the last panels settled into place, the entire region felt lighter, as though a breath had found its own reflection in metal. From such triumphs the Eiffel enterprise swelled. Contracts from Portugal, Spain, Russia, even faraway Asia drifted across his desk. Account ledgers thickened, and clerks walked brisker than bankers. Yet in after-hours solitude, the founder's pen recorded doubts in neat elliptical French. The diaries speak with a hush. I fear I am more accountant than artist, more mason than dreamer. Might iron become a cage if handled without wonder? He wrote these lines under a single lamp, its glow corralled by darkness, and in that ring of light, the contradiction of his character sharpened. The proprietor who counted francs until the figures sang, and the shy technician who blushed if anyone praised the melody. Publicity, nonetheless, became another craft he could bend. When a bridge opened, he arranged for schoolchildren to cross before the dignitaries. The innocence of small footsteps soothed adult anxieties, and newspapers printed photographs of ribbons and laughter. He invited journalists on locomotive rides through previously impassable ravines, letting their articles carry the echo of iron wheels to parlors and cafes. He even allowed a subtle portrait of himself to appear, hat tilted just so, gaze eastward, though he would mutter later that only the structures mattered. This growing mastery of perception met its sternest test when, late one June afternoon, Coquelin arrived with an audacious doodle, a tapered lattice, wider at the feet, pouring upward into the clouds like a chalice of light. Nouguier soon embroidered the idea with spiral staircases and diagonal bracing. The scheme, they explained, would commemorate a forthcoming exposition and proclaim French engineering to the globe. Gustave studied the sketch in silence. Part of him thrilled to its impossible calm, yet part recoiled, hearing once more the diary's confession. More accountant than artist. The tower, if built, would loom above cathedrals and palaces. Ridicule might follow as surely as rust. He carried the drawing home, laid it beside a cooling cup of tea, and wrote, "My name fastened to so high a thing, what if the wind writes its own verdict across it?" Still, calculation is a soothing lullaby for one who speaks the dialect of load paths and laminar flow. He spent weeks massaging the dimensions, turning weight into whisper, drag into dance. By autumn, he conceded that the tower could, in numbers, stand serene. What remained uncertain was its soul, its silhouette against the Parisian sky beloved for domes and spires. To resolve that final uncertainty, he reached beyond the circle of engineers. There was, in the draftsman's quarter, a young architect named Stephen Silvestre, whose sketches blended classical calm with modern grace, the way a river braids currents beneath smooth surface light. Invited to the Rue de Prony office, Silvestre listened while Coquelin explained the skeletal scheme. Then, with deliberate strokes, he outlined delicate arches between the legs, scrollwork balconies, a lantern crowning the summit. Ornamental flourishes sprang like larks at dawn, softening the geometry without smothering its purpose. Eiffel watched, quietly pleased, sensing that the tower would now speak not only the language of iron but also the dialect of delight. An agreement was signed, and Silvestre's name joined the company ledger alongside the older hands, the ink settling like dew on fresh petals. Throughout this gestation, the business empire kept breathing foundries, inhaling ore, offices exhaling drawings, barges ferrying beams along the Seine. Secretly, Gustave sometimes walked the midnight platforms alone, fingertips grazing girders still warm from riveting, murmuring the sums of stresses like rosary beads. The diaries of that period record brief, almost tender sentences. Structure is hope made visible, and later, I am afraid of heights only when I forget the floor beneath is of my own making. Yet he did not banish worry. The taller the vision grew on paper, the longer the shadow of potential failure stretched across his mind. Should a single rivet shear, or an economy contract, the fall would be personal and public alike. Such thoughts he did not share with Coquelin or Nouguier, whose youthful certainty needed no cloud. Instead, he visited schools, lecturing on crystallization of steel, absorbing the pure attentiveness of students as a counterweight to self-doubt. Meanwhile, Silvestre's aesthetic refinements traveled through the workshops in whispered admiration. Riveters who once swung hammers in blunt rhythm now traced scrolls with their gaze, surprised at the notion that iron could imitate lace. Painters tested subtle earth-toned palettes against skylight, seeking hues that might shift gently from dawn to dusk. Even financial officers sensed the project was no mere contract. It was a promise extended upward, asking weather and time themselves to collaborate. Throughout France, the debate scattered like thistle seed on a slow breeze. Some poets declared the tower would puncture heaven. Others prophesied it would lure thunder. Gustave read these lines over coffee, folded the newspapers, and obliged himself to smile at the noise. He had learned, bridge by bridge, that controversy fades the way river fog lifts after sunrise, leaving only the quiet work of holding worlds together. A winter evening found him revisiting the Garabit viaduct for a routine inspection. Snow blurred the horizon, and the arch appeared like a charcoal sketch half-raised, standing on the central span. He recalled a night years earlier when that same wind had bitten his cheeks, but back then no one suspected an iron tower would someday attempt to measure the sky. The memory hushed his pulse. The valley beneath whispered acceptance, as if to say that structures which honor gravity need never fear it. He returned to Paris convinced, though still cautious, and authorized detailed proposals for the exposition committee. Drawings, multiplied into monochrome forests, pinned along corridor walls. Cruchlin computed live-load diagrams. Nouguier negotiated steel suppliers. Sauvestre chose motifs influenced by the curves of the Seine. Gustave, ever the reluctant visionary, balanced ledgers one moment and poetic anxieties the next, writing, "Perhaps progress is simply patience given form." Contracts were drafted, stamped, and sealed. Yet no shovel touched earth. Not yet. There remained public hearings, municipal permits, the soft politics of persuasion beneath chandeliers. For those gatherings, Gustave donned a broader-brimmed hat and rehearsed modest sentences that would not betray the tremor of hope in his chest. He spoke of safety factors and municipal revenue, of how visitors might ascend to absorb the panorama of Paris, how telegraph wires could anchor to the pinnacle. Each phrase, deliberately gentle, escorted the notion from fancy toward inevitability. By degrees, resistance weakened. Minds accustomed to masonry began to imagine millimeter-thin webs of iron. And while debates tapered, the founder continued his nightly practice, a slow walk through silent workshops, as though listening to unborn lattice sigh in its dreams. The diaries note, "Silence before creation is louder than applause after." In that hush, chapter 3 settles, like cooling steel surrendering its glow to darkness. The early bridges still shoulder trains across placid rivers. The Garabit Arch still holds the sky's reflection. Nouguier, Coquelin, and Sauvestre confer over lamplight, and Eiffel, reluctant yet resolute, gathers courage as carefully as he gathers calculations. Beyond the factory roofs, dawn's first line of pewter light suggests a coming excavation, the measured strike of spades upon Parisian soil. What rises next will ask the city to look upward with new eyes, but for now the night lingers, resting gently upon the unbuilt tower's sleeping blueprint. Up Bonjin, twilight, had only just folded itself around the banks of the Seine when the design teams drifted back into their lamplight-lit offices, carrying with them the shimmer of the river and the faint, metallic tang of possibility. The previous chapter left the narrow streets of Paris, murmuring with the promise of an iron monument. Now the promise must pass through pencil point, slide rule, and sleepless deliberation. Long after cab wheels had ceased clattering across the cobblestones, Gustave Eiffel's draftsman unfurled new scrolls of translucent tracing paper, the thin sheets fluttering like moth wings in the soft current that drifted beneath a half-opened window. Silence settled, but it was a vibrant silence, the charged quiet of minds moving faster than speech, faster even than ink. During these first hours, the tower existed only as graphite wisps, each line tentative yet glowing with calm intent. An engineer named Émile Nouguier traced an exaggerated arch, then tilted it inward until the curve seemed to rise of its own quiet will. Next to him, architect Stephen Sauvestre roughed in a filigree of diagonal bracing an iron lace that would lighten the eye yet stiffen the spine. Tracing paper overlapped. Tracing paper, transparent leaves building toward a ghostly thicket of possibilities, some soaring, some squat, all searching for that elusive proportion between grace and gravity. Charcoal dust gathered at fingertip creases. Nearer the lamp glass, a plume of bluish smoke drifted upward from forgotten coffee warming on a spirit stove. One page was discarded only when another. Truer page rose before it, and so the stack thickened, a sedimentary record of inspiration. Gustave Eiffel passed quietly among the tables, his footfalls muffled by worn carpet. His eyes absorbed each sketch without judgment, saving praise for the moment when form and force would finally fuse. Carbon smudges had blurred the cuffs of his linen shirt. He did not notice. The mind of the structure was beginning to speak, and he listened for its calm, unwavering phrase. Soon he spread the drawings across the central work table and summoned Maurice Courtland, renowned for daring yet disciplined mathematics. Together they began to annotate the airy scrolls with looping numerals, grades of iron, slenderness ratios, tentative rivet counts. No one raised a voice. The room's hush pressed like velvet against every surface. At dawn, thin sunlight peeled across the sketches, revealing a forest of delicate lines now annotated by denser constellations of digits. An early pastry cart rattled in the lane, but inside the office time moved by different stars. Caitlin fetched the leather-bound notebooks that held his wind-load formulas, equations first formed while watching gale clouds roll unhindered across prairie plains. Those same equations had guided the pylons of distant viaduct. Now they were invited, almost ceremonially, to evaluate a tower whose summit would pierce the winter mistral. He measured projected surface areas, then wrote calm ciphers along each leg, luminous little promises that the lattice would breathe, flex, and settle back again without complaint, even under gusts no Parisian had yet felt. Across the cast, the table Victor Contamin, master of structural detail, quietly sharpened a red pencil. He began plotting positions for 7 million imagined rivets-minute ruby points appearing one by one across the graphite dusk. Each point represented twin hemispheres of wrought iron clamped and swollen under the white heat of portable forges. Yet here they glimmered as simple pinpricks of crimson. Diagonal after diagonal, joint after joint, he mapped the quiet rhythm of assembly that would one day echo across a sky-framed site. Those points, aligned like careful stitches, promised that no panel would carry more fear than its neighbor. Strength would be social, shared through endless triangulation. When his pencil finally slowed, the sheet looked less like machinery and more like a firmament, a domestic galaxy drifting obediently inside the margins. Still, a question lingered above every success. How might visitors ascend without dread? The challenge eased open a new door in the hushed atelier, admitting two outsiders whose names carried a soft mechanical music of their own, Otis and Rue. From distant workshops where safety brakes first caught falling platforms, the Otis engineers offered cables, pulleys, and quiet certainties born of countless trial shafts. Leon Roux, meanwhile, brought Parisian finesse. He imagined cabs paneled in polished wood, their progress cushioned by hydraulic pistons whispering in oil. Together they sketched vertical wells inside the tower's angled legs, wells that curved gently with the tapering silhouette so passengers would glide in smooth parabolas rather than abrupt leaps. The concept felt at once daring and inevitable, as though the skeleton had always harbored these invisible arteries, ready to lift hearts by measured increments toward the upper air. As day folded back into evening, Eiffel gathered the pile sketches, equations, rivet matrices, elevator diagrams, and began drafting the legal armor that would shield them. Patent petitions rustled like parchment leaves, their dense paragraphs, verifying originality in the calm language of law. Earlier that week, a rival consortium had whistled rumors through cafes, hinting at a similar lattice proposal. Now every line of ink declared precedence, drawing an intangible fence around the newborn design. Clerks signed, stamped, and tied silk ribbons. The folded packets slipped into leather portfolios, destined for the patent office, where they would sleep beneath wax seals until curiosity stirred 10,000 bureaucratic fibers. Within the atelier, purpose remained unhurried yet unstoppable. Draftsmen transferred the choicest silhouettes onto sturdier Bristol board, inked them in confident sepia, and trimmed the edges with bone knives that made almost no sound. From these elevations, a timber model began to rise, each piece planed to the thickness of a thumbnail, then slotted together without force. The carpenters worked as though shaping a musical instrument. Shavings lay curled like pale feathers across the bench, carrying the faint scent of cedar resin. By lamplight, the model gleamed, its lattice glowing honey gold, the deck levels poised like quiet pauses inside a melody. Even silent, the miniature suggested the hum of wind along cables and the faraway murmur of pedestrians craning their necks. Transporting the model to the selection jury required a carriage ride. At dawn, when Paris streets were still dreamlike and dew glistened on the flanks of horse harnesses, the crate was cushioned by wool blankets and steady hands. Inside, the wooden tower rested unshaken, its minuscule rivet heads gleaming like morning frost. The carriage wheels rolled over bridges and under gas lamps that flickered their last before the pale sky absorbed them. No. Trumpets announced the journey, no crowds gathered. Only the rhythmic clip of hooves and the faint creak of leather straps spoke to the moment's significance. The jury assembled in a high-ceilinged hall washed with indirect winter light. Some members carried the weariness of long public duty, others the bright skepticism of youth. On a velvet-covered plinth, the crate was opened, and silence floated outward as the tower emerged. For a heartbeat and perhaps two no comment broke the room's stillness. The lattice, fine as embroidery yet undeniably muscular, rose from 4 square feet of polished baseboard to a summit that almost brushed a chandelier's fringe. Observers stepped closer, searching for the heavy bulk they had feared, and met instead an airy geometry that seemed to invite the gaze straight through itself toward something wider than vision. One juror, a mathematician, raised a lorgnette to study the bracing. Another, a novelist, smiled faintly and folded his hands, content to wordlessly concede the tower's quiet authority. When questions came, they arrived in hushed, almost reverent tones. Would the leg footings withstand flood-softened soil? What margin of safety guarded the elevators? How would expansion under summer heat be calmed? Eiffel and his lieutenants answered without rush, as though reciting verses learned by heart around a winter fire. Charts appeared. Wind tunnel sketches slid forward, rivet counts unrolled in rhythmic columns. Yet even while logic spoke, the model itself continued to argue the case more persuasively than mathematics. It simply stood, light on its timber toes, and asked the room to imagine a much larger echo of its poise shining above the city. By early afternoon, sunlight had crossed the hall, drawing lattice-shaped shadows onto parquet floors. A vote was called. Pens scratched softly. Papers folded. Outcomes were sealed in envelopes that would later be opened amid modest ceremony. But anyone who had watched the jury's faces while the model glowed could already read what lay inside. The crate was closed once more, yet in each observer's inner eye a spectral tower lingered, widening the city skyline with its silent silhouette. Late that same evening, back in the atelier, work lamps dimmed to slumbering embers. Engineers drifted home, hands still carrying an invisible memory of tracing curves through air. On a central shelf, the patent certificates lay stacked like pale bricks, each stamped page a silent sentinel guarding the dream. Beyond the window, the sky gathered faint stars over the river stars soon to find a daytime rival in riveted iron. In the hush, the design now felt less like conjecture and more like an object already half-assembled, waiting only for ground to be broken. Night deepened, and with it came thoughts of next steps. Surveying crews mapping the Champ de Mars, caissons sinking toward bedrock, and boilers firing to heat the first field forges. These images drifted gently through the workshop like low clouds gliding over hills. The lamps were finally snuffed. Graphite sticks were capped. The tower retreated to rest within folded drawings. Outside, the Seine slipped under stone arches, reflecting nothing yet of iron lattice, but soon. But soon, very soon, river and tower would greet each other in mirrored calm. For now, possibility slept, breathing softly alongside the city. It would quietly transform. In the distance, a cathedral bell counted midnight, each note falling slower than the last. The atelier's door swung closed with a muted sigh, and Chapter 5 waited just beyond that threshold, where morning light would reveal survey stakes piercing soft turf and marking the tower's newborn footprint in the quiet heart of the Champ de Mars. Just beyond, a fading echo of Chapter 4, the image of bundled steel rails quivering beside the Seine drifts gently into dusk. The spring air is still scented with tar and fresh sawn timber, yet twilight hushes the clang of hammers and folds. Paris in a muffled mauve. From that muted scene, the story floats inward, toward salons where chandeliers wink softly over velvet conversation, and toward print shops where lead letters cool inside inky trays. It is into these parallel chambers, one cushioned by brocade, the other bristling with newsprint, that the next hush of history settles. Ever since Gustave Eiffel's daring lattice had slipped from drawing board to municipal docket, admiration and alarm had shared equal chairs at every cafe table. The admiration, gleaming, stemmed from those who savored Iron's rising poetry. The alarm, smoldering, came largely from the cultivated circles guarding Paris's classical skyline as though it were a sleeping infant. By early February, that alarm organized itself into the celebrated or notorious protest of the 300. Poets, painters, playwrights, even the occasional composer, signed their florid names beneath a single guarded sentence that a gigantic black smokestack threatened the serenity of Notre Dame, the dignity of the Louvre, the whispered symmetry of every city vista once traced by Haussmann's compass. What might appear a lattice of air to a bridge builder, they described as a crushing monument to industry, unbefitting a city of cathedrals and colonnades. A journalist from Le Temps, leaning over his dispatch box, coined the phrase that would doze in headlines for weeks. La Tour Ténébreuse, the Tower of Gloom, while his counterpart at Le Figaro preferred imagery more domestic. A colossal fireplace chimney turned upside down upon a table set for emperors. Each morning, paperboys in street corner clusters flapped these metaphors like startled pigeons. The feathers they scattered were words, and the air grew dense with them. Café patrons stirred spoon against porcelain in unconsciously deliberate circles, trying to gauge whether the future should be folded away like an unwanted pamphlet or pressed open like a new edition of the encyclopedia. Above those cafes, attics marrowed with cigarette smoke hosted earnest gatherings. Under soft lampshades, painters who had once quarreled over impressionism now found harmony in their resistance. The pointillist and the academician, the symbolist playwright and the staid novelist sat shoulder to shoulder, each convinced that this slender iron javelin could pierce the very soul of beauty. Gustave Eiffel was, by habit, a man of measured breath, of carefully aligned figures, and gently persuasive nods. Yet even he felt the scald of rhetoric. He responded not with shouted debate, but with the tempered steel of argument. A small clutch of pamphlet spray covers, maroon lettering issued from his office near the Champ de Mars like low clouds sliding from a hillside. In meticulously phrased paragraphs, he reminded readers that cathedrals, too, had once been condemned as brutalities of stone, that the iron of his tower was thinner, pound for pound, than the masonry of any belfry, that what rose was not a factory chimney, but an ode to geometry. He quoted, with sly gentleness, from the works of several protesting authors, turning their own metaphors, inside out to reveal quiet reverence for audacity and voyage. Now and again he slipped into humble recollection of bridges that had stitched provinces together, of railway arches that allowed mothers and sons to greet each other by dawn instead of by next season. Iron, he wrote, was simply stone awakened to agility. In the hush following each sentence, one might almost hear the river nod in agreement. The pamphlets traveled by postal satchel to parliamentarians, by evening coach to editorial offices, by glove-lined pocket to the very cafes where satirists sharpened nibs. Some critics conceded a fraction of wonder. Some remained unbudged. Yet even the most immovable skeptic had to acknowledge the eloquence of the engineer's pen. for it moved not in attack, but in patient clarification, as though he polished a glass between himself and his adversaries, so that both might see the horizon more clearly. While pamphlets drifted hand to hand, another debate coursed through the marbled corridors of the Hôtel de Ville. City councillors, their voices softened only by high ceilings and thick carpets, weighed costs against civic pride. The forthcoming Exposition Universelle promised crowds, and crowds promised coins, but budgets were like swans on a pond, graceful above water, paddling frantically beneath. Who, precisely, would pay for 7,200 metric tons of puddled iron? For elevators yet unperfected, for guardrails, gas lights, viewing platforms, and the army of riveters who would stitch each beam. Some councillors argued for full public financing, citing cultural patrimony. Others balked, fearing that failure would empty the city coffers and stain them with rust. Eiffel arrived at these sessions with rolled technical drawings under one arm and a portfolio of ledgers under the other. On thick cream paper, he had mapped out an arrangement that seemed to breathe fiscal prudence. He proposed to shoulder a majority of the cost, around 4/5, if Paris would grant him an operating concession of 20 years. During that span, ticket proceeds and souvenir rights would repay lenders, reward investors, and possibly yield the city a modest dividend. After the 20th anniversary, ownership would revert, complete and unencumbered, to the municipality. It was a structure as airy as the tower itself. Weight carefully calculated, spans designed for resilience, loads distributed, so even skeptics could walk across without shuddering. In private notes, Eiffel reflected that 20 years was an eye blink against the long ledger of time. He suspected the Iron Giant would stand far longer than any contractual sunset. Yet his concession plan coaxed cautioners into calm, for it posed no immediate taxes upon flour sellers or grocers, or the wagon drivers who rattled dawn milk across cobblestones. Newspapers inclined toward public accounting praised the scheme's ingenuity, likening it to modern toll bridges where passage paid the mortgage one carriage at a time. Still, the protesters persisted. On certain evenings, gatherings spilled from salons onto balconies, strung with ivy, where orators gestured toward the sweep of Parisian rooftops, arrayed like porcelain. They imagined the proposed structure piercing moonlight, casting restless shadows upon the Luxembourg Dome. Their disquiet was not solely aesthetic. Some claimed iron would attract storms, others that crowds would throng until the Champ de Mars collapsed under muddy strain. Against these forebodings, Eiffel offered patient demonstrations. Scale models trembled in wind tunnels. Lightning studies grounded cables deep into stable clay. Crowd flow diagrams resembled silken ribbons rather than clogged drains. Each answer mellowed one fear, yet two new anxieties often sprouted beside it, like nettles along a garden path. Through it all, the tower itself still only vision, and numbered beams seemed to hover between realms, half imagined, half inevitable. Street lamps flickered on along the Quai d'Orsay, and in their yellow halos young draftsmen hurried with cylindrical tubes tied in twine. A gondola of written ideas drifted over the river each night. Editorial sonnets, municipal minutes, shareholder charters. Ink shimmered like wet feathers. Iron waited like a chrysalis. Eventually, the city council gathered for a vote under the tall, restless murals of French history. Voices rumbled but rarely rose. Even opposition was muffled, as though every tongue recognized a turning had arrived. The resolution to adopt Eiffel's concession plan passed by, margin neither slender nor sweeping, but softly sufficient. There was no eruption of applause, only the subdued scrape of wooden chairs toward polished tables, a collective exhalation that smelled faintly of lemon-polished oak. Outside, gaslights tremored and resumed their steady glow. Passers-by, unaware, traced evening errands through streets soon to be watched by a sentinel of iron. News of the vote slipped into morning papers with a tone more resigned than celebratory. The tower, once derided as a menacing smokestack, had secured its footing in the realm of probability. Protesters did not disband. Their signatures remained inked upon the record, yet the brush of finality had touched the canvas. Some artists, recalibrating curiosity, began sketching tentative outlines of what the structure might look like at dawn, or beneath winter snowfall, or mirrored faintly in a rain puddle outside the Palais de Chaillot. Even their criticism shaped perspective. In imagining the tower, they had already begun to live alongside it. Gustave Eiffel, pausing at his study window, could not yet see the lattice rise, but he sensed its emerging silhouette, the way a mariner senses coastline before the fog thins. He placed one pamphlet upon another, tied them with dark string, and set them carefully within a walnut cabinet. Arguments, he believed, had served their span. The remainder would belong to bolts, beams, and the measured cadence of construction. Below his balcony, the city flowed with lantern light, and somewhere a lone newspaper page turned, whispering future headlines. Night settled over Paris as if skewered gently by church steeples, then draped loosely around mansard roofs. In that velvety stillness, the Seine carried reflections of polished bridges, the very bridges whose ironwork had first tutored Eiffel in patience and proportion. The water's hush promised that debates, like ripples, would fade beyond the arches. What endured would be the quiet articulation of rivet meeting rivet, of ingenuity climbing skyward step after step. Soon, crews would clear temporary sheds along the Champ de Mars, measure chalk lines in pale dawn, and hoist the first basal plates onto cedar blocks. But that slow unfolding belongs to another moment. For now, the narrative rests with the murmur of signatures drying, with pamphlets stacked, with city ledgers aligning under the amber warmth of municipal sconces. Somewhere on a drafting table, a final revision waits, its margins dusted with eraser shavings, serene as snowfall. In the gentle hush before ground is broken, the iron giant still sleeps inside arithmetic, an aspiration poised between quarrel and quiet resolve. When the next chapter unfurls, muted hammers will begin their measured lullaby, and the river's mirrored clouds will watch iron unfurl upward. Until then, Paris breathes peacefully beneath its unaltered sky, unaware of the slender geometry that will soon invite dawn to dance upon every riveted seam. Night had drifted away from the broad lawns of the Champ de Mars like a velvet curtain pulled without hurry, leaving behind the final glimmer of lantern flame that had closed the previous chapter, those quiet specks of light wavering above survey stakes and chalk marks. As dawn breathed silver along the Seine, the sketches that once floated only on parchment were ready to meet the earth itself, and so the story sinks for a moment beneath the future lattice, down into the patient ground. Here, before iron may rise, mud must be understood, water coaxed aside, and hidden rock persuaded to bear the weight of dreams. Surveyors arrived first, their figures small against the morning expanse, wooden tripods opening like cautious wings upon dew-peeled grass. They spoke little, preferring the tick of instruments and the sleepy whistle of river wind. With telescopes steadied, they tasted horizons, sipping angle and distance the way others sip warm broth, transferring each silent measurement to notebooks bound in rag paper. Beneath their feet, the soil lay like a layered lullaby, soft silt from forgotten floods, stubborn clay that remembered Roman footsteps, and deeper still, a shelf of limestone older than memory itself. The men listened, marking where mud surrendered and where bedrock began. Soon long white rods were pressed into the ground, and augers twirled with slow circular grace, lifting cores that glistened in low light. Each cylinder told a secret, moist caramel loam, speckled sand, pockets of unexpected peat. Engineers, wrapped in wool coats, bent close to examine the fragments as though reading weathered letters. They weighed granules between gloved fingers, recorded moisture with pocket chronometers, and sketched tiny grains that would never be seen again. What they sought was certainty, a calm assurance that the plane could cradle two shimmering arches, and the layered tower above, and certainty, like sleep, begins deep within. Closer to the riverbank, where groundwater murmured beneath a skin of gravel, the plan demanded bolder gestures. Pneumatic caissons, wooden chambers, rimmed in iron and sealed beneath by compressed air, were assembled like floating crates, then eased into shafts that filled with milky water. Within their humming bellies, men descended, mustaches quivering in the pressurized hush, lamps dangling in amber halos. Every foot advanced below sent bubbles rising in lazy spirals to the surface, and above, the Seine accepted them without complaint, as if exhaling a dream of its own. Down there, mud was scooped, bagged, lifted. Space cleared for concrete that would never be seen. Time moved differently under pressure. Heartbeats could be heard within helmets, and conversation shortened to gestures. A nod, a thumb against the chest, a chalk mark upon damp timber. The men worked in pairs, careful not to startle the air that held back the water. When they paused, they could sense the river pressing like a giant, gentle palm against the walls. Sometimes they emerged through the airlock exhausted, cheeks flushed crimson, hearing ringing as though distant church bells had drifted beside them. A doctor waited with warm tea and slow questions, noting each name, protecting them from the subtle peril of the bends. When cavities were cleaned and the caissons rested steady on gravel, concrete flowed, pale and viscous, smoothing every corner with unhurried patience until the chambers became solid monoliths fused to the earth. Upon these, masons laid the first courses of limestone and granite, stones cut square with the meticulousness reserved for fine jewelry. Gauges measured tolerances in millimeters, not centimeters, and any flaw thicker than the width of a thumbnail was quietly chipped away beneath muted hammers wrapped in cloth. Level after level rose, only knee-high, yet each held within it the calm promise that the tower's legs would stand true and forever. At midday the sun warmed the blocks, releasing the subtle scent of wet dust, and the masons' chisels tapped a slow percussion, softened by sandbags, echoing along the scaffolds like a distant metronome, guiding the afternoon. Lines of twine, stretched taut as harpstrings, hovered above cornerstones, while brass plumb bobs shimmered and pointed unwaveringly to the heart of the planet. Between lifts, trowels spread mortar in thin lullaby layers, gray ribbons folding over themselves with the grace of cream poured into porcelain. Nothing was rushed. Even impatience seemed to doze, lulled by the discipline of geometry and the quiet weight of stone. Each evening, when the final bucket was lowered and the last chalk mark dusted away, inspectors drifted across the site like caretakers of a private orchard, placing their ear against blocks to hear settling, pressing calloused hands to gauge the day's subtle warmth. Lanterns revealed gleaming brass rods embedded in the footing survey points that would guide steel rivets months hence. They took readings, compared columns of figures, and confirmed once more that opposite piers differed by less than the thickness of a parchment page. Numbers, cool and precise, slipped into ledgers, yet beneath the arithmetic flowed a gentler conviction that accuracy could itself be a form of kindness. Beyond the fence of sawn pine planks, Paris hummed. After 12-hour shifts, boots dragged along cobbles toward cheap boarding rooms or the smoky glow of absinthe cafes under striped awnings. In those fragrant interiors, green glass decanters caught lamplight, and weary wrists loosened as the anise aroma coiled upward. Conversation meandered from football to family, often circling back to the strange new tower whose shadow did not yet exist. Some boasted of depths conquered, others worried about heights still to come. Laughter mingled with the soft scrape of dominoes, and now and then a cough reminded everyone how dust can nestle inside lungs like winter sparrows. Steel clips, the first safety harnesses Paris had seen. Management had ordered them from an English foundry, after hearing tales of men swinging high above the fourth bridge. Workers fingered the rivets, testing springs, unsure whether the device was friend or fetter. A few practiced fastening the strap around the waist, leaning backward against a beam in moonlit yards to feel the harness seize and hold. Whatever their doubts, a quiet promise lay within the invention, that one might return home after dusk with every bone intact, the music of evening still ahead. Soon, however, winter drifted across the basin, muffling Paris in damp wool. By December of 1887, the Champ de Mars resembled a monochrome engraving: grey ground, grey sky, grey breath curling from lips. Frost glazed the timber ramps, turning footsteps into whispered slides, and cement froze in barrows before it could be poured. Workers thawed sand with small coal braziers, cradling hands above orange embers. Masons kept stones under burlap covers to shelter them from brittle cold. Yet within that hush, a different silence arrived. No locomotive chuffed into the siding. No gang hoisted steel beams, for the rails north of Rouen had stalled beneath snowdrifts. The shipment of puddled iron plates, essential for the tower's legs, lingered in distant depots, and schedules penned in confident ink blurred uncertainly, like letters seen through fogged glass. Site foremen recalculated tasks, stretching mortar work, polishing tools, inventing chores to keep calloused palms employed. Still, crates emptied, casks lightened, and the rhythm that had rocked the ground since spring faltered to a hesitant pulse. Some feared that the delicate continuity, so painstakingly nurtured, could unravel thread by thread, for even as the Seine kept flowing, time itself felt trapped in ice. In the hush of halted wheels, stray dogs padded unfazed across the siding, leaving paw prints that froze before morning, and above them gulls traced patient circles, as if reminding the men that movement still existed somewhere beyond the stalled rails. Yet schedules, like ice, crack, eventually beneath the steady press of spring sun. Rumors drifted through the cafes, riding steam from coffee cups. A coalition of critics at the Academy petitioned City Hall to halt construction, citing ugliness, danger, folly. Newspapers printed scathing sonnets. Politicians rehearsed speeches about skyline purity and fiscal prudence. On site, supervisors read the broadsheets in silence, then folded them into neat rectangles and slipped them into pockets already heavy with measuring tapes. The foundations, now cured and gleaming beneath straw mats, seemed indifferent to rhetoric. They were simply there, steady as breath. Yet the men sensed how quickly human resolve can waver, and they guarded the newly born footings with a protective pride that needed no words. At last, on a pale morning when icicles chimed softly beneath scaffold planks, the first wagons of steel arrived, the metal dark yet luminous with promise, and the yard awoke again. Forklifts would not exist for decades, so teams of horses leaned forward, muscles rippling, delivering girder after girder toward the anchored masonry, where they rested like sleeping harps waiting to be tuned. Soon the caissons and stones hidden below sight would yield the narrative to iron, rivet, and sky. For now, the plain remained hushed, holding that quiet inhalation before ascent. An inhalation we shall follow in the next chapter as the tower begins to climb. Night had scarcely dimmed the tender gleam of freshly planed pine when dawn spread a muted pearl across the Champ de Mars, revealing the four tapering legs, resting in tranquil equilibrium after their recent meeting beneath the first platform. A sigh of mist curled between their latticed ankles, as though the river had paused to admire its own reflection in iron. In that soft hush the project breathed, neither asleep nor fully awake, hovering at the edge of another strenuous day. What had yesterday been a daring outline now waited to become a woven reality. Slowly, the city's pale sky brightened, guiding attention away from the ground toward the great warehouse upstream where the next act had already begun. At Levallois, long before bells tolled, lanterns glimmered over orderly aisles of prefabricated pieces, stacked like immense metallic ferns. Each plate, gusset, and angle had been drafted in Gustave Eiffel's drawing rooms with arithmetic precision. Yet here they reclined in quiet readiness, their edges softened by the cotton cloths that separated them. Traveling cranes floated above, almost silent, lowering bundles onto waiting wagons, whose timber sides smelled faintly of resin, warmed by kerosene lamps. The workshop resembled a still aquarium, iron swimming slowly through space, accompanied by the subdued rasp of measuring tapes being reeled and the low murmur of ledger pages turning. Beyond the open doors, the river accepted these offerings, barges nudging the quay with hollow heartbeats before sliding into the current, carrying the tower's future element by element toward its destined cradle. Along the Seine, the convoy moved at a patient, almost meditative pace. Frosted breath rose from dray horses, mingling with the thread of smoke from tugboats, both suspended beneath the creamy glow of a reluctant sun. Echoes of hammering remained far behind. Here only the soft slap of water against hulls marked time. Each cargo was cradled beneath tarred canvas, yet occasionally a gust lifted the fabric and allowed a glimpse of rivet holes glinting like constellations on dark sheets. Houseboat dwellers watched in silence, recognizing that these unobtrusive panels would soon ascend beyond every tiled rooftop in Paris, binding sky and city in a new conversation. The river, accustomed to secrets, bore them onward without ceremony. When the barges eased against the Champ de Mars landing stage, a faint metallic perfume mingled with river silt and winter grass. The sleepers of the temporary rail track, laid expressly for this phase, were still damp with dew that caught early light in pinhead prisms. Forked jacks and wheel dollies welcomed the cargo, guiding each piece to numbered stacks beneath canvas awnings. There was no clamor, only an orchestration of nods, gestures, and the almost maternal tap of wood mallets, coaxing beams into alignment. Somewhere a lark tested a hesitant trill, then fell quiet, as though joining in the tacit agreement that today's efforts deserved reverent silence. Beneath the awnings the iron awaited its ascent, patient as moonlit stone. High above, perched on the angled legs, two cantilevered creeper cranes prepared to climb with deliberate grace. Their frames resembled skeletal creatures native to some calm mechanical forest, every joint greased to move without protest. Bolted to the very structure they helped erect, they would hoist themselves upward by turns, advancing like contemplative inchworms along a copper-tinted branch. With each small rise, their platforms acquired a slightly wider view of the city's slate roofs and distant horizons, while below, ant-like figures dwindled into the geometry of boulevards. In this gentle progression, the tower seemed almost self-assembling, a growing vine of iron lifting its own gardeners toward the light. On the staging platforms, rivet gangs assumed their stations, 4 men to a team, bodies turning with slow, practiced cadence. One held the furnace cup, coaxing slender rivets to a cherry glow. Another tongs-borne courier passed each ember toward the hole. A third braced the heavy bar against the far side. The fourth wielded the pneumatic hammer, its murmuring thrum wrapped in layers of felt to soften the impact. The sequence unfolded again and again, a formula spoken in heat, pressure, and precise timing that observers would later liken to a hot red ballet. Steam curled from damp scarves tied around wrists, while drifting flakes of scale settled on timber boards like black snow that melted into nothingness when touched. No shouted orders disturbed the rhythm. The gleam of a lifted eyebrow or the settling of a shoulder sufficed. Beneath the dance lay quiet revolutions in metallurgy. The wrought iron arriving from the 4 DuPont furnaces had been purified through the best puddling available, its fibrous grains aligned for tensile resilience, its carbon content moderated to endure both frost and August blaze. Eiffel's engineers, cautious dreamers, had commissioned exhaustive tests on slender coupons, subjecting them to slow, measured pulls until they yielded with almost musical sighs. From the data grew new confidence. Thinner plates could shoulder wider loads, and delicate lattice could override crude mass. Each rivet, steel cord, and countersunk distributed stress like a droplet into still water, ensuring that no single point bore loneliness. Thus an age-old material learned new possibilities. not by defiance, but by attentive listening to its own internal harmonies. Week slid into week, winter into the pale shiver of early spring. The 200-meter line fell beneath the gangways, then 250, until one February morning, a crystalline hush accompanied the breaching of the 300-meter mark. Snowflakes wandered through the web, landing on warm rivets and vanishing with faint sighs. Up there, air tasted subtly thinner and carried a whisper of alpine resin from forests far beyond the horizon. The tower's sides inclined more sharply now, narrowing toward the summit that still existed only on paper, yet even unfinished. The structure commanded a tranquility that surprised passers-by. Its sheer momentum felt effortless, as though both earth and sky had long desired this meeting and were relieved to discover it, unfolding so gently. When the milestone measurement had been verified, a folded parcel of cloth was raised by pulley to the highest secure platform. Seamstresses at Cluny had stitched it from dense silk that would catch the light without snapping in the wind. Hands unknotted the cords, and 3 calm colors streamed out: deep blue, clear white, and warm red, cascading in slow motion before settling into a languid flutter. No bugles broke the silence, only the hollow hum of breeze threading through open girders. From below, the banner appeared small against the sky, yet its presence rang quietly through every corridor of the construction site, affirming that the edifice had become not only a marvel of engineering, but a shared emblem, gentle as a lullaby, yet enduring as granite hills. On the ground, Foreman Pillett removed his cap and allowed a rare smile to soften the stern set of his jaw. Nearby laborers paused beside steaming cauldrons of pitch, their mugs of chicory coffee cooling unnoticed as they tilted their heads upward. Even the horses shifted weight from one hoof to another, as though recognizing an invisible cue. There were no cheers, yet a subtle warmth infused the air, mingling with coal smoke, to form an aroma, part celebratory, part domestic. Some spoke of letters they would write that evening, describing the site to distant villages. Others merely resumed work with renewed gentleness, the banner's distant sway folded into their breath like a familiar lullaby. Across the river, along the embankments where chestnut trees kept silent vigil, pedestrians noticed the new palette above the skyline. The tower, already surpassing church spires and senate domes, now carried its own modest aurora. Reflections trembled in puddles left by recent rain, turning sidewalks into mirrored corridors through which the tricolor glided. Bakery windows, still misted by dawn ovens, caught tiny fragments of the banner's hues with encrusted sugar grains. Although newspapers would report the achievement in measured columns, the more persuasive account resided in private impressions. A certain likeness threading morning errands, a borrowed patience during queues, an almost imperceptible hush inside trams rattling toward the hill of Chaillot. Meanwhile, the relentless yet unhurried choreography continued. Patterns of perforated gussets reached upward, awaiting braces that would soon lock them into hexagonal constellations. Creeper cranes, now seasoned climbers, adjusted counterweights with practiced poise, their cables singing low harmonics each time the wind shifted. Rivet furnaces glowed like tame comets in the gathering dusk at shift change. The heated rivet buckets were transferred with ceremonial care, embers painting fleeting constellations against canvas sleeves. Logbooks recorded temperature, torque, and torque-induced twist, numbers set down with graphite that left faint smudges resembling charcoal leaves. Every entry, though humbly mundane, contributed another quiet thread to the widening tapestry proof that grandeur may grow from the simplest observation repeated without fatigue. Stepping back, one could discern the likeness of a colossal web spun not by hurried instinct but by deliberate artistry. Each diagonal member gleamed faintly when mist settled, capturing droplets that clustered like pearls on nocturnal silk. Sunlight slipped through at oblique angles, staining interior shadows with soft gold and dusky lavender, while gulls glided between the legs as though within the nave of an unfinished cathedral. The city, with its drifting network of boulevards and bukinistes, found in the rising tower a mirror of its own labyrinthine charm, complexity arranged toward calmness, motion resolved into poise. And so the nascent monument stood, unguarded yet unassailable, breathing steadily in the cool wind. When twilight finally gathered, lanterns were hoisted along the scaffolds, their glow settling on iron flanges like warm dew. Far below, clerks extinguished archive lamps and secured blueprints in leather tubes, aware that tomorrow's agenda would concern elevators, hydraulic pistons, and the delicate problem of guiding visitors upward without disturbing the tower's quiet soul. Clouds drifted northward, trailing faint violet, and the newly unfurled banner folded gently against its mast as though nestling into sleep. Work would pause only for the span of a sigh, then resume with equal serenity. In the stillness, the half-finished summit beckoned, promising forthcoming chapters of ingenious machinery and luminous night-lighting stories that were already glimmering just beyond the edge of evening. Night had slipped gently across the Champ de Mars at the close of our previous tale, its velvet folds settling over the iron lattice, while the last rivet shimmered like a solitary star. In that hushed glow, the tower seemed complete, yet expectant, as though holding its breath for dawn's deliberate unveiling. Now, with morning seeping along the Seine in pearl-gray ribbons, the panorama stirs again. Carriages rattle far below, their wheels dampened by dew-soft dust, and somewhere within the forest of girders, a muted clink replies, reminding every sleeper in Paris that Inauguration Day has quietly arrived. The hour is gentle. Before crowds are allowed to drift beneath the arches, a final ritual of reassurance is staged high above the lawns. Engineers, crisp-collared yet bleary from calculations, gather beside the newly installed Otis lifts. Thick steel cables, coiled like dormant serpents, are deliberately severed to demonstrate the machinery's layered safeguards. The cabin, weighted with sandbags, begins a brief descent, then halts with the soft authority of hidden brakes. A sigh moves through onlookers, half mist, half relief. The tower, it seems, will not betray its guests. Even gravity must negotiate its path through Eiffel's ordered logic on this crisp April morning. Eager to match steel with sinew, Gustave Eiffel proposes a more personal proof. Ministers in frock coats accept his invitation, and together they mount the spiral staircase that threads skyward through the trusses. Rain-polished steps glimmer. Each landing releases a widening view. Slate rooftops, drifting smoke, the faint checkerboard of distant fields. Eiffel, stopwatch in hand, keeps count of seconds and heartbeats alike, his calm moustache hiding a pleased smile whenever dignitary pauses for breath. At the summit-flagged platform, cheeks flushed and lungs awakened, the party gazes across a horizon newly stitched by riveted iron and spring light. By late afternoon, the exposition gates released their long-awaited river of visitors. Families, artisans, scholars, and sailors step softly onto the gravel paths, their garments catching flecks of sun that slant between pavilions. The tower's entrance hall hums with restrained excitement, candles already kindled against the coming dusk. Electric lifts glide like lantern boxes inside the hollow legs, doors opening with polite inevitability. Inside each car, a low buzz of dynamos accompanies the ascending hush. Faces tilt upward, eyes reflecting girders that unfurl as though endless. When the final stop is reached, twilight has folded Paris into mauve repose. Silence. Above the murmuring city, the platforms breathe with murmurs of their own. Quieter now, as though height itself had placed a finger to every lip. Children press fingertips to chilled railings. Adults lean into soft breezes that smell faintly of coal smoke and lilac, and somewhere a violinist tests a wavering note that seems to hover without echo. Gas lamps flicker along boulevards below, forming constellations that mirror the gathering stars. For a moment, no one speaks. The tower, freshly baptized by human wonder, stands perfectly still, feeling the weight of all those hearts beating in borrowed air this evening. While eyes feast, pens labor. Correspondents from many languages bend over tiny desks in the restaurant alcoves, ink pooling like midnight ponds upon crisp sheets. They sketch metaphors, tally elevator voyages, and pen brief telegrams that will race along copper veins toward distant capitals. Photographers coax their cumbersome cameras toward railings, patient as astronomers. Glass plates capture lovers laughing, waiters pouring coffee, the river curving like a ribbon of brushed pewter. Within days, postcards will migrate across oceans carrying powdered grains of Parisian dusk inside their pigments. The iron giant, only hours christened, is already everywhere at once through imagination. Not long after sunset, a hush precedes a shy flicker along the balustrades. Technicians throw polished brass levers. Set like pearls along the walkways. Electricity, still a novelty, whispers through copper threads, coaxing out a gentle halo that settles over umbrellas and parasols. Some visitors raise gloved hands toward the luminance, half expecting warmth, half blessing the unknown. The tower responds in kind, its profile outlined in a subdued glow that neither dazzles nor dims the constellations. It feels less like triumph and more like a lantern lifted inside the world's collective pocket tonight. But amid the swirl of spectacle, a quieter contingent arrives with notebooks rather than opera glasses. Scientists have secured chambers within the second level, resolving to turn celebration into laboratory. They suspend a long, lacquered sphere from a cable descending through the hollow belly, reviving Foucault's graceful experiment on a grander scale. Hour by hour, the pendulum scrides its slow circle across marked sand, silently announcing Earth's steady rotation. Visitors pause, heads tilting, as if listening for the planet's hidden metronome. In that soundless swing, they sense a kinship between celestial certainty and the patient lattice around them of iron. Elsewhere, copper instruments glimmer beside glass flasks that inhale the breeze. Here, the fledgling meteorological observatory catalogues pressures, temperatures, and moisture at altitudes previously measured only by balloonists. Each reading arrives unhurried, a quiet syllable in a growing poem of weather. Clouds drift eastward, trailing their shadows over the Luxembourg gardens. Barometers sigh. A clock enters numbers in precise columns. The tower, so recently judged by its height, now gains depth through data, embedding itself within the invisible architecture of atmosphere. Knowledge, like the wind it courts, moves unseen yet alters every surface it encounters along its restless spiral journey. High in the lattice, the wind itself becomes an unseen instrument. It threads through diagonal braces, sending low harmonic murmurs that migrate along the beams like whale song in a midnight sea. Workers who remain on duty learn to interpret these tone-sharp whistles, predict a coming squall. Deep groans advise caution with suspended loads. On opening night, the air is merciful, offering only gentle chords that pulse around the flagpole and dissolve into the sky. Listeners find the music oddly consoling, as if the atmosphere were rehearsing lullabies for the city resting beneath its enormous, patient harp of tempered iron strings. General Jean-Charles de Borda's delicate apparatus is installed next, comprising ivory scales, mirrored prisms, and a descending weight timed by pulses of light. From the top platform to the esplanade below, the acceleration of gravity will be measured with fidelity previously confined to theoretical pages. Each droplet of data falls like a silent bell, affirming the embrace between matter and motion. For the observers, the experience is oddly devotional. Steel columns replaced by cathedral pillars, test results by whispered prayers. In the union of structure and study, the tower reveals a new vocation as sentinel of precise mysteries for human thought. Meanwhile, shadows lengthen, softening rivets and ruffles alike. Electric bulbs illuminate the arcades in gentle amber, turning bolts into beads and girders into ribbons of quiet flame. Dinner is served on porcelain that trembles ever so slightly, whenever a lift begins its climb. Laughter rises in warm plumes, then drifts away, diluted by the open sky. Far below, the exposition closes its gates for the night. Lanterns are extinguished, yet the tower remains aglow, solitary and serene, a lighthouse for dreams rather than ships. Its heartbeat, felt in the subtle hum of generators, keeps even darkness company through the sleeping city's hours. Thus the opening day settles into memory, not with fireworks but with a lingering hush, as though Paris collectively turns a page yet postpones the next sentence. Art and industry, imagination and empiricism, have met upon this iron promontory and discovered they can dance at a whisper's volume. Formulas cradle grace, and the breeze carries both without preference. The tower's story, once hammered in workshops, now seeps into minds like slow perfume. Every observer will continue it differently, yet all versions will rise and taper in the same elegant silhouette against the moon this spring-lit night. Later, when lamps are dimmed and corridors cleared, a single caretaker walks the perimeter, his footsteps echoing like measured raindrops upon the timber decking. He pauses to secure a window shutter, then lingers, listening to the sigh of steel cooling under starlight. Somewhere below, the river murmurs its gentle counterpoint. He knows that tomorrow will bring new challenges, wind tests, maintenance schedules, and the delicate art of keeping wonder operational. Yet tonight the structure rests, and Paris with it, ready to let dawn reveal fresh questions that only patience and persuasion can answer in their own unhurried, measured tempo again. In the gentle pause between one day's spectacle and another's routine, the tower stands as a promise that height may nurture humility, and that metal, properly guided, can lift thought as easily as tourists. Soon engineers will return to test the limits of light itself, tracing beams through evening haze and mapping illumination onto the city's darkened canvas. But for now, the iron giant slumbers, its shadow folded neatly at its feet, awaiting the subtle spark that will teach it to write with radiance across the night and sing soft arias in the language of phosphor and star-soothed silence. Night lingers over the Seine, the silver flicker of the previous chapter's closing lamps, still trembling upon the water as the sky colors itself in a muted indigo. From that afterglow the tale moves onward, gliding almost imperceptibly into the hush of the new century, a moment when, despite all its filigreed iron and glinting promise, the Eiffel Tower was quietly scheduled to vanish. For deep inside its original concession contract, hidden among articles and annexes drafted at the fluent stroke of 19th century pens, there rested a curt clause. 20 years after the exposition of 1889, the structure would revert to the city of Paris and, unless preserved for public utility, time-patient, impartial, counted down with the faint click of clocks. No one noticed until 1909 hovered near the horizon. It is difficult, under the current moon, to imagine demolition cranes nibbling at those lattice limbs. But in the upholstered offices of municipal officials, the prospect appeared entirely practical. The fair was finished, the novelty wearing thin. Tastes shifted toward other spectacles. Beyond the brass railings at the tower's base, boulevards bustled in habitual indifference, and a few newspaper columnists even murmured that Paris would recover her pure silhouette once the staking post came down. Yet in the private study of Gustave Eiffel, papers lay spread across a broad mahogany desk like unfolded wings, each sheet bearing the careful sketches of a man determined to prolong his creation's heartbeat. His answer would not be aesthetic persuasion, but serve as an argument forged of wires, waves, and the newly articulated language of electricity through air. Radiotelegraphy had begun its tender infancy, crackling currents leaping from coil to ether and back again. The tower, rising 300 meters above the river's languid run, offered an unparalleled aerial. Eiffel invited uniformed officers to climb the spiral stairs, to stand blinking in the breeze while engineers tuned their clumsy apparatus. In those demonstrations, sparks stitched messages between Paris and distant forts, dismissing the need for a vast forest of masts. The army, ever attuned to advantage, took note. Soon cables trailed down the iron ribs like silver vines, and the tower, originally crowned by a decorative beacon, now bristled with utilitarian purpose. It was, Eiffel insisted, no mere amusement ride. It was a strategic instrument the Republic would be reckless to remove. Negotiations unfolded quietly. Reports were drafted, endorsements obtained, and by the closing months of 1909, the city conceded that the tower, so recently threatened by oblivion, had earned a stay of execution. Its lease was renewed, the saw blades returned to their shelves, and Paris, perhaps without ceremony, accepted the presence of its metal sentinel for an unspecified future. Above the smoke of coal fires, the aerials continued to hum, testing wavelengths, courting the invisible. The lull before the Great War drifted over Europe like a deceptively placid fog. Café orchestras played, fashion houses fluttered with silks, and beneath the tower's arches children chased hoops along the Champ de Mars gravel. When August 1914 ruptured that calm, the tower's novelty evaporated. It became an immediate limb of national defense. Operators in headphone caps sat within its belly, fingers poised over keys that conversed in code. Only a short train ride away, the plowed fields near the Marne quaked under artillery. From those trenches, German transmitters rattled orders intended for their advancing columns. High above Paris, the tower's aerials listened as a fisherman listens to river currents, catching stray words, coordinates, and intentions. On the 7th day of September, the intercepted fragments aligned like shards of broken mirror, revealing an army's flank exposed. Commanders in the French War Ministry seized upon the intelligence, redirecting troops into a countersurge that bent the invader backward and, for a breathless instant, spared the capital. The newspapers did not trumpet the tower's role. Secrecy served survival. Yet within the drafty wireless room, the operators, bleary-eyed, understood that the lattice had become a subtle sword. Its strength no longer measured in rivets, but in information gleaned from nocturnal air. Years slid forward on rails of hardship. Victory arrived, tempered by mourning. When the armistice's ink had dried, Paris returned to civilian rhythms, though every gust along the avenues seemed to carry residual echoes of static. The tower paint flaking, elevators groaning remained both landmark and instrument, adapting to the peacetime tasks of meteorology, broadcasting, and academic experiment. Yet history, true to its pendular nature, prepared another upheaval. In the spring of 1940, the low drone of engines overshadowed the city. Occupation followed. Boots on cobblestones, proclamations pasted to kiosks, flags unfurled from facades. German authorities, eager for a theatrical gesture, ordered a swastika banner hoisted from the tower's summit. The chosen standard, stitched to dominate the skyline, proved in its ambition too wide, too heavy. Once freed from the ascending rope, it hung limp, draping upon the iron like a sagging sail, refusing to catch the wind. Within hours the fabric tore, its ragged shreds flapping against the truss, a sullen emblem of overreach that made even the sentinels at the footrails shift uneasily. Frustrated, the occupiers requisitioned a smaller replacement, while elsewhere partisan whispers multiplied. Not all forms of resistance required explosives. Someone never named severed the elevator cables. Whether by sabotage or mere denial of privilege, the result forced visiting dignitaries to climb on foot, if they wished the panorama. Propaganda photographers rarely confessed the climb's fatigue. The images published showed uniformed figures smiling upon the top platform, though their breathing must have come in sharp, private gasps. Through nights of blackout, the tower stood darker than it had since its inauguration. The lamps removed, the beacon dimmed, Only the mute geometry of girders persisted, silhouetted against starfields that wars could not commander. Allied aviators, crossing France in furtive missions, sometimes glimpsed the shape by moonlight, a familiar skeleton hinting at perseverance beneath oppression. Liberation arrived, like dawn itself, slow, hesitant, then unmistakable. Flags changed once more, cables were restrung, and a band struck the Marseillaise beneath the reopened arch. Yet victory did not erase decay. 70-year-old paint, once a gleaming Venetian red, had weathered through ochre into umber, gouged by rain laden with wartime pollutants. Inspectors struck at plates with small hammers, listening for dull thuds that betrayed corrosion hidden within. Beneath decorative arches, flakes fell like black snow upon tourists' shoulders. Beneath the first platform, rust-furrowed rivet heads. Some sections, they warned, might endure only 10 more winters without remedy. Thus a new campaign arrayed itself not with artillery, but with brushes and buckets. Beginning in 1954, scaffolds crept up the legs like measured vines. Painters in harnesses daubed 3 subtly graded tones, lightest at the apex, deepest near the ground to preserve the tower's contour against the bleached sky. The work could not be hurried. Each stroke required wire brushing, priming, and patient overlay, for 29 distinct layers of earlier coatings had to be reconciled. Crews sang to keep rhythm, their voices muffled within respirators, and from dawn until dusk the smell of fresh linseed and lead pigments mingled with the scent of roasting chestnuts from vendors below. The tower received 10,000 liters that season, and nearly as many small attentions. A tightened bolt here, a realigned stair tread there, all recorded in notebooks whose pages now crackle in archival drawers. When the final scaffold plank descended, Paris looked up at an iron giant renewed, the late afternoon sun folding itself over the clean plains like a shawl. The landmark, once threatened by contract, by cannon fire, and by corrosion alike, had reclaimed its poise through humble persistence, the steady tap of hammers, the rhythmic dip of brushes, the unrecorded patience of anonymous craftsmen. Even in renewal, the tower never ceased its dialogue with the invisible. Antennae, refined and multiplied, glimmered at the pinnacle, handling broadcasts that stitched diaspora to homeland, headline to household, melody to memory. Below, elevators, their cables now robust with post-war steel, resumed their gentle ascent, cabin lamps glowing warm against the dusk as though nothing in the past half-century had happened to disrupt their circuits. And yet, the lattice remembers. Each rivet bears a fingerprint of the decade that forged it. Each platform railing holds stories told in whispers of Morse, in hush of sabotage, in clang of maintenance. Thus, Chapter 9 comes to rest in the stillness of a Parisian evening, the tower standing quietly, neither monument nor machine alone, but a supple balance of both. The wind drifts through iron trellis work, with a sound like distant surf, carrying no urgency. Shadows stretch across the Champ de Mars lawns, the grass exhaling coolness after a long sunlit vigil. Overhead bulbs prepare their slow nightly awakening, ready to stipple the sky with domestic constellations. Beyond the present hush, further realms of inquiry await, for the story extends into laboratories and light shows, into television signals and global pageants, chapters in which technology and artistry entwine ever more intricately. In that gentle anticipation, the scene folds inward like petals at twilight, keeping its quiet counsel until the narrative turns again. The afterglow of last night's lantern light still seems to shimmer on the iron lattice, a memory more than a gleam, as dawn settles into a pale rose haze over the Champ de Mars. In that softened first blush, the tower appears almost weightless, its great legs floating rather than resting, and the hush that follows a night of illumination lingers like a sigh. It is from this muted moment that we drift forward, attending to the ways an old colossus continues to renew itself, year after patient year. 7 tons of paint. The phrase itself feels slow and deliberate, like the measured sweep of a giant clock hand. Every 7 years, crews ascend the maze of girders with brushes no wider than a palm, laying down 3 successive coats from tip to toe. They choose shades not by whim, but by delicately staged debate. Should the metal shimmer bronze like morning coffee, glow warm umber like late honey, or lean into the dappled gray of distant mountains? The practice is both ritual and repair, sealing out moisture, sealing in myth. As layers accumulate, they bury fingerprints of past decades, yet each hue discloses the era that applied it. A secret seasonal ring, visible only to those who study cross-sections under glass. Even the very name Tower Brown seems hushed, part color, part character, while brushes work outward. Modern ingenuity creeps inward. Along the first-floor platform, panels of glass have replaced weathered planks, creating a quiet frill, transparent rectangles through which visitors watch miniatures drift across the gravel far below. Yet the engineering is anything but theatrical. Laminated crystal was selected for its tempered calm, its capacity to remain clear without glare, and its willingness to join iron without protest. If the 19th century wanted metal to defy gravity, the 21st wishes to dissolve it, inviting sky and city to trade places beneath the feet of wanderers who pause, press palms to the railing, and feel the old structure breathing around them. Above those panels, discrete wind turbines nestle between struts once left vacant. Their blades turn in slow, almost meditative circles, harvesting breezes that glide up the Seine Valley. Painted the exact shade of their surroundings, they vanish visually, audible only as the gentlest murmur like linen flapping on a balcony line. The energy they gather is modest, yet symbolically vast, an acknowledgement that monuments too must pull their weight in a changing climate. In quiet rotation, they whisper solidarity with distant fields of white propellers, an unhurried promise that tradition need not stand still when the world bends toward renewal. Cinema has long cast the tower as a silent confidant, a sentinel at the edge of many plots. In silver screen romances, its silhouette frames first kisses. In noir, it broods over alleyway intrigue. Fashion houses borrow its crisscross for catwalk lattices, projecting models forward like sparks from the Iron Lady's furnace. Protesters have unspooled banners down her ribs, confident that a message blinking from such height will find attentive eyes. Each gesture affirms her as canvas rather than backdrop, a participant whose presence shapes the tone of any scene. To become so heavily symbolized yet remain available for reinvention is no small feat. It demands an openness rare in structures forged from rigid steel. Scholars of resilience gather data on wind scour and acid rain, on micro-vibrations created by elevators shimmying through the legs, on the slow migration of rivets settling deeper into their sockets. Computer models, intricate as lace, forecast another 3 centuries of structural health if maintenance continues its measured cadence. That projection is less a prophecy and more a reflection of the tower's temperament. Steadfast, adaptable, content to absorb the iterations of time. In studying her, engineers derive blueprints for bridges yet unborn, for ocean platforms dreamed in universities, still echoing with night shift vacuum cleaners. The tower, once a daring experiment, has become a tutor in longevity, speaking fluently in the grammar of loads, moments, and fatigue. Climate, however, does not bargain. It demands attention. Salt blown inland from receding ice, longer summers baking protective coatings, sudden storms rattling plates, all conspire to test the iron's patience. New alloys and nanocoatings are thus evaluated alongside the humble brushstrokes of painters, Scientists propose sensors no thicker than a thumbnail to sit quietly inside joints, sipping data on humidity and stress. Their reading download at dawn when traffic is low, a heartbeat check that preserves serenity while guarding against surprise. It is a tenderness both technological and almost parental, a vigil kept so that the landmark may continue its contemplative watch over the river. Yet grand icons do not belong solely to engineers. They belong to bakers folding dough at 4 a.m, to commuters whose glance upward steadies breaths between tasks, to poets who find in its lattice a shorthand for possibility. They belong to children tracing triangles in condensation on bus windows, convinced that even geometry can be playful. The tower answers each of these private claims without protest, because identity, like light, expands to fill every offered vessel. It stands at the crossing of personal and collective memory, an axis around which individual stories spin and occasionally converge. The yearly repainting, the turbine's gentle hum, the scholar's censor, the filmmaker's framing each layer adds not weight but resonance. Over time, the structure has slipped from the narrow domain of building into the wide meadow of metaphor. It is a metronome measuring the pace of national moods, a weather vane of cultural dreams. When new colors arrive, debates ignite about continuity versus change, and through that conversation a community rehearses the art of adapting without erasing. The very act of discussing paint becomes a rehearsal for discussing any common future, measured, respectful, pigment switched for policy, steel for spirit. In quieter chambers of the tower's administrative offices, archivists keep ledgers of maintenance dates, glass tensile strengths, and voltage generated by turbines during windy weeks. The pages lie open on polished tables, like illuminated manuscripts. Inked annotations roam the margins, tiny corrections, clouded speculations, sketches of bracket designs. To leaf through them is to wander a forest of incremental decisions, each small but none insignificant, all converging in the steady survival of a dream once thought temporary. It reminds the reader that durability often rides on the shoulders of acts so modest they remain nearly invisible. As the sun now angles westward, the tower gathers that gold around herself the way a shawl gathers around resting shoulders. Shadows lengthen across the interlaced steps. The turbines settle into dusk's sweeter breezes. High above, the flag flutters with a restrained confidence, aware that its pole stands on groundwork first riveted into place when telegraphs still clicked and horses still clicked, and horses still clopped. The span between then and now feels porous, bridged by continuity and daring in equal measure. And so we arrive at reflection. The Eiffel Tower began as daring engineering, a wager of iron against pessimism. In her constant reinvention, she teaches that audacity need not be a single spark. It can be a sustained glow, nourished through maintenance, imagination, and dialogue. When a society chooses to sustain boldness across generations, the result is more than a skyline. It is an evolving identity, resilient enough to question itself without surrendering its outline. Through paint debates and glass floors, through discrete turbines and the hush of sensors, a nation rehearses the art of being at once rooted and restless, reverent and reinvented. Now, gentle listener, the final light slides behind the horizon, and with it our long wandering through girders, gears, and gleaming panes draws to its close. May the quiet persistence of that iron giant linger with you as softly as twilight, reminding you that structures and spirits can both stand firm and keep changing. Breathe easily. Let the imagined night wind circle slow around the lattice, and rest in the assurance that somewhere above the silent city, the old experiment still keeps peaceful watch.